Hey, good morning and happy Easter. So glad you're here this morning. If we haven't had a chance to meet yet, my name's Garry. I'm one of the pastors here. So glad you tuned in from wherever it is you're tuning in from. Thanks for the pictures that you guys are sending in. We've asked you to send pictures in to let us know where you're tuning in from. And you guys have been rising to the challenge. We got tons of them coming in. Just a reminder that if you don't want your face on Instagram or Facebook or anything in social media, to not include it in the pictures because we will be posting them. But thank you. Keep sending them in. They're such an encouragement for us to know that we're all connected and together even though we're not together. And one more big shout out for all the frontline workers. We have a lot of people in our church that are working on the front lines in the hospitals and all that type of stuff. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And a special shout out to my sister who's in New York fighting this thing. Thanks, Joan. Well, I'm really excited. Today we get to kick off a brand new series called This Changes Everything. Because throughout history, whether that be our own personal history or world history, there are events that take place that from that point on, things are never the same. For instance, World War I, World War II, things were never the same after that. 9/11, it forever changed the way we do travel. In 59 seconds in December 1903, the way we travel around the globe changed when the Wright brothers flew for the first time. And how about this? In 1957, two teenagers met, just by chance, struck up a conversation, and it forever changed the landscape of music. Those two people, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and the Beatles. You know, I had one of those this changes everything moments back one night in August 1979. Remember like it happened yesterday. I, along with a couple of my buddies, found ourselves at Cultus Lake at a church camp. And we weren't there attending the camp. We were there taking a bunch of kids water skiing. And one night, as we were sitting on the beach of Cultus Lake by our campsite, having a campfire, we heard a bunch of girls screaming and giggling and splashing around. And so from the safety of the dark, because it was a little kind of a wuss when it came to girls when I was younger, I yelled out, who goes there? To which came the reply, why don't you come and find out? Well, not being one to back down from a challenge, my buddies and I hopped in the ski boat and we putted our way across, kind of just honing in on the voices that we were hearing. And we ended up at this dock. And that's when everything changed for me. From that moment on, my life was different because standing on this dock was this girl. And I think of the Beatles song, and I saw her standing there. Now, I don't know if it was her straight hair, the shape of her eyes, her laugh, or that smile, braces and all, but something about her just grabbed me. And I was just infatuated with her. And so we spent the rest of the night talking, and then same thing the next night, and the night after that, and the next thing you know, we're dating. And then in a few years, I found myself standing in front of a church, staring into her eyes, saying, I do. I mean, that's a life-changing moment, is it not? Life was never the same after that. And a few years after that, I experienced another one when she came to me and she said, hey, we're pregnant. And then a few months after that, I'm standing in a delivery room, and this nurse hands me this slimy lizard-like looking creature, which turned out to be my daughter. And I mean, that is a life-changing moment. Life has never been the same since. But like me, you have your own moments, right? Whether good or not so good. Where from that point on, things were just never the same. Maybe for you, that day was the day you got your driver's license. Man, you remember that? It was like, freedom! I can actually go do something now. Or maybe for you, it was the day you lost your license. Maybe for you, the moment that changed everything was, like me, the day you got married. Or the day you got divorced. Maybe the event where things changed for you was the day you moved out of the house on your own for the first time. Or maybe it was the day that changed everything for you is the day you had to move back in. Or maybe the this changes everything moment for you was the day the doctor called with the test results. Whatever it is for you, good or not so good, We all have moments where from that point on, things are never the same. In fact, we're experiencing one right now, are we not? We're in a moment in history where life as we know it has changed. This pandemic has changed everything. It's changed the way we interact with one another with social distancing. It's a phrase I hope to never hear again. It's changed the way we converse with one another, 6-foot distancing. It changes the way we shop for simple things like groceries. I went to Costco last week with my wife. Worst experience I've ever had. It was like everyone was staring at each other like, you've got the plague, which I guess we kind of do, but I don't know, it was just weird. The way we do church has changed. Speaking into a camera. I just love being with you guys, and I wish we were together this morning on the greatest day in history, but we're not. Everything's changed. It's an event. It's changed everything. And for millions of Christ followers around the globe, Easter is the event that changed everything. It's the pivotal event, the linchpin, the cornerstone that supports the Christian faith, the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead 3 days after being crucified on a Roman cross just over 2,000 years ago. It's a fascinating story to be sure. And it's a story that brought hope and still brings hope when things seem hopeless. It's a story that in a lot of ways included many of the same challenges that you and I are facing today. It's a story that had people that were afraid, discouraged, hunkered down in their homes, unsure and wondering about their future. The story began on a Thursday in the late afternoon as Jesus and his closest followers gathered together to celebrate a meal called the Passover, an annual celebration that the Jews continue to celebrate, where they all would stream into the city of Jerusalem, gather together to remember God delivering their ancestors from slavery under the hands of the Egyptians. And the evening began with celebration. It may have begun with celebration, but in just a few short hours it would end with a betrayal and ultimately Jesus' arrest. A hasty trial held under flickering lights in the high priest's palace followed. An early morning Friday, shuttles to Pilate and then to Herod and then back to Pilate again sealed Jesus' fate. He was sentenced to death by crucifixion. It's ultra-violent brutality designed to discourage against anything that was against Rome. And history records that by 9 a.m. on Friday morning, soldiers were pounding nails into the hands and feet of Jesus, jerking him upright on a cross to let him hang in the sun until he died. And after 6 excruciating hours, Jesus breathes his last. To ensure he's dead, the soldiers ram a spear into his side to drain his body of any fluid. They then pulled him off the wooden beams that he was nailed to and allowed 2 eager leaders, 2 eager men to prepare his body, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. And they had to hurry because Sabbath was coming. And there was no work to be done on the Sabbath, and preparing a body for burial, well, that was considered work. And so they wrapped Jesus' body in grave clothes, took him to a tomb, and placed him there, where a rock was placed over and sealed. The disciples of Jesus, those that had followed him for 3 years, had stuck by his side, had left long before. They were in hiding, afraid, depressed, discouraged, no doubt in shock at how quickly events had changed, and wondering, what next? A physician, a man named Luke, who wrote one of the biographies of Jesus found in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, tells what happened next this way. He writes this, he says, very early on Sunday morning, the women went to the tomb. taking the spices that they had prepared. You see, while the men hid, a handful of women who had nothing left to lose gathered the courage to risk a visit to the tomb of Jesus, hoping that the soldiers would let them apply the burial spices to his body and fully prepare Jesus' body for burial. It was a common practice that many ancient civilizations observed. And we read that on the way to the gravesite, they were discussing, how are we going to move that stone away? It's a big stone, a big rock. How are we possibly going to move it? But when they arrived, it had already been moved. And Luke records this. He says, when they found the stone rolled away from the entrance, they went in. And this is when the wonder began to emerge, because they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus, and they did not know what to think. These women who were close to Jesus, if we read through the biographies of Jesus, they show up. They were supporting him and his disciples. But they were thinking what everyone else was thinking. Jesus was dead. They weren't thinking resurrection. Resurrection was not even on their radar. And understandably so. They were there when Jesus died. They were there when he took his last breath, when he was stabbed in the side, when he was removed from the cross, when his body was wrapped in linen and then put in the tomb that they were standing in. And as they stood there puzzled, two men suddenly appeared to them, clothed in dazzling robes, it says. And the women were terrified and bowed with their faces to the ground. I just got to take a time out here for a second. Because as I was working through this story, I'm thinking to myself, good for them, because if I was there, I would like to think I would have done the same thing, but I don't think I would have. I think I would have done one of three things, and one of them wasn't bowing. I think if that had happened, if I was there when that happened, two angels dressed in white showed up, I would have either ran, I would have just bolted out of there, I would have passed out, or I would have needed a wardrobe change because I would have lorded my shorts. I'm just keeping it real. I'm just being honest. That would have just freaked me right out. But they bow, and then the man asked, they asked this question, why are you looking among the dead for someone who's alive? He isn't here. He's risen from the dead. Remember what he told you back in Galilee? I read that. I thought to myself, my wife says that to me. Why didn't you take the meat out of the freezer? Do you remember when I told? Oh, yeah. So he says, remember when I told you back in Galilee that the Son of Man must be betrayed into the hands of sinners? The Son of Man was a title that Jesus used to describe himself. That Jesus must be betrayed into the hands of sinful men, be crucified, and that he would rise again on the third day. Do you remember that? And I can just imagine them counting Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And then they remembered that he had said just this. I mean, we've all had something like that happen, right? When someone's trying to explain something to you and you feign that you understand what they're saying by, yeah, I know what you're talking about, but really you haven't a clue what they're talking about. They're trying to explain instructions or something to you, and you're like, yeah, I understand what you're saying, and you walk away like, I have no idea what they just said. But then somebody explains it to you again, and all of a sudden it clicks, and you go, oh, that's what you were, oh, now I get it. That's what's happening. They're wondering what's going on, trying to comprehend their friend's missing body. Was it stolen? Was it taken? Was it moved? And then all of a sudden they understand what Jesus has been saying all along about who he is. And it makes sense while the body is gone. Because Jesus did exactly what he said he was going to do. He rose from the grave on the third day. Understandably, they can't contain themselves. Good news, right? That's why it's called the gospel. It's the good news. Jesus isn't dead, he's alive. And so they rush back from the tomb to tell his 11 disciples and everyone else what had happened. And it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and several other women who told the apostles what happened. They come running in and they're like, guys, you wouldn't believe this. We were at Jesus' tomb and he's not there. Because he's alive. He's not dead. Listen to the reaction. But the story sounded like nonsense to the men. So they didn't believe it. And you know what? I wouldn't have either. I would have been right there with them thinking, people don't come back from the dead, and maybe that's where you are with this story. You read it and you think, there's just no way. I don't believe it. It's nonsense. Listen what happens. Peter. And if you're not familiar with Peter, he's a guy we talk about a lot at the meeting place. He's a fisherman, this rough, gruff fisherman. He flies off the handle all the time. He does things without thinking. He's a bit of a coward. At this point in the story, he has denied Jesus 3 times. Even though he admitted he knew who he was, Jesus one day asked him, "Who do you say I am?" And he says, "You're the Messiah, sent from God." But on the night that Jesus was betrayed, the night before he was crucified, Peter denied him 3, ever knowing him. And so he's hiding out as all this is taking place. And these women come running in and say that Jesus is alive. And Peter, who spent 3 years with Jesus, saw him heal people, give sight to the blind, hearing to the deaf, mobility to the lame, speech to the mute. He saw him as a restored people with leprosy, restored them back to the way they were. He was in boats in storms when Jesus just said, "Calm down," to the wind and the waves, and they calmed down. That Peter jumped up and ran to the tomb to look. Stooping, he peered in and saw the empty linen wrappings. And I love what he does next. It says, then he went home again, wondering what happened. Wondering. I love that last line because it reminds me, for me personally, that it's okay to wonder. It's okay to work through the story of Easter, because understanding it is so important when it comes to our faith. And the way we describe faith around at the meeting place is it's having confidence. Faith is having confidence that Jesus is who he said he is, God, that he is good, and he can be trusted to do everything he's ever promised to do. And when he walked out of that grave 2,020 years ago, he backed it all up. So here's something to throw into your wondering cocktail this morning. Without the resurrection of Jesus, our faith, the confidence we have in Jesus, is useless. It's useless. And this isn't a recent discovery or anything like that, or a recent thought. Listen to these words found in a letter written to some first century Christians who were struggling with resurrection, the whole story of resurrection and the possibility of resurrection. And so they get a letter, and here's what it says. Listen to this. If there is no resurrection of the dead, then Christ has not been raised either. And if Christ has not been raised, then all our preaching, telling the good news of who Jesus is and what happened, is useless. It's just a bunch of gibberish. And your faith is useless. Because Jesus, you can't have confidence in Jesus because he isn't who he said he was. He can't be trusted. He isn't good. And he can't back up his promises. You know, some will say that the Easter story is one of two things. It's either the most ridiculous, stupid lie ever made up, or it's the most remarkable event that has ever happened. It's either worth nothing or it says everything. I love how Timothy Keller, he's a theologian, author, and pastor, he said this about Easter. Listen to this. He says, if Jesus rose from the dead, then you have to accept all he said. If he didn't rise from the dead, then why worry about anything that he said? The issue on which everything hangs is not whether or not you like his teaching, but whether or not he rose from the dead. You know, it's not my place to be here and tell you what you should or shouldn't believe, especially when it comes to the Easter story. We've got enough of that going on, don't we, with the press? You know, wear a mask, don't wear a mask, do this, don't do that. It's fake. It's not that bad. it's worse than you think. I mean, we don't even know what to believe in here. So that's not, I'm not trying to do that here. But what I will do is this, is I will invite you to give yourself permission to wonder about this story. To really wonder about this story. I invite you to engage it for what it is, without passing judgment on it. Maybe if it's only to consider that this one remarkable event had the power to change the entire world, to the degree that today, around 1/3 of the humans that are walking on this planet consider themselves and call themselves followers of Jesus. That alone is worth something to wonder about, is it not? I invite you to wonder, but I want you to know that wondering can be scary. Because if you take the Easter story as it is, a real story, a true story, if you dare to imagine your story woven into the Easter story, you never know where it might lead you. You might end up like Peter, who wondered and ended up believing. Who wondered and ended up so completely embraced by the unconditional love of the resurrected Jesus that it transformed him from a fearful, cowardly, doubting, angry, discouraged man to a man who was alive and free and fearless. Who, along with others who dared to let that story invade their hearts, went on to forever change the world. Easter's the story that thunders a reality across history. A story you will hear nowhere else. That God, that created everything, became human, was crucified, resulting in the greatest love meeting the greatest cruelty humankind is capable of. And God responding to that hatred with forgiveness. Jesus rose from the grave not in anger or vengeance, but in forgiveness, full of grace and mercy and acceptance, and most of all, unconditional love. A love that will sustain and uplift you in the darkest moments of your life. A love that will uphold you with peace and hope when you're not sure what tomorrow brings. When the medical results come in. A love that will not walk out on you if he or she does. A love that will comfort you as you stand by and grieve at a graveside. A love that will pick you up when you fall, restore you when you fail, carry you in your old age, and answer you when you call. It's a love beyond understanding, beyond containment, beyond predictability. It's beyond anything in this world. And it's a love that is available to anyone and everyone who chooses to believe and accept that Jesus is who he says he is, that he is good, and he can be trusted to do everything he's promised to do, which is to reconcile you back to God. Bring redemption and restoration and healing to our lives. It's a love that is real. It's a love that is alive. It's a love that was powerfully unleashed in the events of the Easter story. Easter is worth taking time to wonder about because Easter changes everything. I invite you to pray with me. God, we read this story, and from this side of death, it seems so final that we're not sure what comes after this. But by reading this story and hearing who you are, we know that the end here is just the beginning of something beautiful that's going to stretch into eternity. And it's that fear of dying that can bind us up and kind of muck us up and stop us from believing this incredible story of you coming to this earth, compelled with nothing but love for us, and being willing to die for us, but then coming back to life so we can come back to life. And we can experience that now as you resurrect us. Some of those things in our life that are just part of our past that we'd rather forget. You can redeem all of that, and we thank you for that. We thank you for what this day represents for so many people around the world. Thank you for loving us. Thank you for Easter. We pray this in your awesome name. Amen.